And she calls us blacks.
N-word.
I'm the other
The
black
N-word.
girl.
Let's get to the N-word.
I mean, I know I'm black.
Do we have?
Now you want to address what I have to say.
Do we have a house in here?
Yeah, you.
Okay.
Do we? Hey,
Yeah,
do we? Would she please stand up?
An Alabama city leader is facing backlash for using a racial slur during a council meeting. This is not decades ago or even years ago. This was this week, Monday night. It happened in Tarrant, Alabama, a town that's 53% black according to the latest Census Bureau numbers. When the mayor asked City Councilman Tommy Bryant to address his wife's alleged use of the N-word on social media, he deflected and instead told a black colleague to please stand up after he so boldly and comfortably asked if there were any house N-words in the room. The Alabama Republican chairman called the remarks completely unacceptable, and the state Democratic Party has demanded Bryant resign, but he says he won't resign nor apologize. In fact, he says he might run for mayor. Bryant also said he's not the problem and that the real problem is Wayman Newton, the city's first black mayor. Bryant claims he was only repeating words the mayor used during a previous private meeting. And when asked if he was racist, Bryant said, "What a lot of the public's definition is, I might be a racist, but according to what the true definition of racist is, absolutely not." Here to help us break down this story and explain once and for all the true definition of being a racist is Brittney Cooper, professor of Women's and Gender Studies and Africana Studies at Rutgers. Professor Cooper, it seems to me, in the context of this, he might have been trying to say this person is not a house N-word and you shouldn't have said that if you behind closed doors or whatever. But how did people start to get so comfortable that they can use this phrasing in any context? I remember Bill Maher saying that he would have been a house N-word and having to defend that. Where are we in the language of racism and access to it and the appropriate venues and ways in which, if ever, white people can use words like house N-word?
Look, white people are out here being real slick right now. Call it the Trump effect, where there's an attempt to sort of reset the public conversation so that brazen shows of disregard for civility towards black people are allowed. And there are always these flimsy excuses. I was quoting someone else, or as happens a lot with my students, well, y'all use the N-word, so why can't we? It can't be that offensive. White folks have to own they are the ones who made this a term of anathema for black people. They are the ones who created a history where they committed heinous acts of racial violence and dehumanized us through the use of that word. It is always and consistently off limits to them. They don't need to quote it. They don't need to say it. They don't need to recount it. But he wanted the opportunity to use it and then to use the cloak of saying, well, someone else used it, someone black used it, and so I can use it too. And what is so interesting to me about white folks around this kind of thing is like, one, why do you want to be able to use that word? Two, when is, oh, well, black people can do it, so now I want to be able to. When has that ever become the marker of what is possible for white people in the United States? But it becomes a really disingenuous opportunity to be disrespectful to us.
So also talk to us about the idea of reclamation of painful language, right? This is not just something that black people do. Other racial groups do it. Women will use use language that coming from someone outside the group would be offensive, but in group it is a reclamation and a defanging of that language. People in the LGBT community will use language that in group they have reclaimed, but coming from anybody else outside that group would be harmful. Explain that dichotomy, because it seems like people have such a hard time when they hear you say it and you're not in group, you're in group, and they're outside the group, and they say, well, I want in to the group to use the language that you use.
Look, absolutely. There are a couple of things. So we see this in queer communities, Jewish communities, as you said, among women, that terms that have been used to dehumanize us, to be derogatory towards us, we often use them in closed community as a way to take the sting out of those terms, as a way to play on the stereotype that is being animated when the terms are used by people with power. But the things folks got to remember, particularly around the N word, but also even when you want to use, if you try to use slurs towards gay folks, for instance, right? We're talking about power. And one of the reasons that white folks in particular struggle with this is because what they don't want to acknowledge is that they have power and that it's not just the use of the word, it is the ways in which these folks legislate sets of policies that actually make life harder for Black people. And then on top of that, they want to use language that they orchestrated and engineered to be disrespectful, and then to say that now that you have taken your power to redefine these words, now we want to accede to your definition. That you don't get to have it both ways. You don't get to both terrorize us with that word and then argue that you get to use it as a term of endearment. It doesn't work that way. And I think that white folks in particular struggle with the idea that things would be off limits to them because, I mean, these are folks whose history, whose ancestors came to a land that had already been found and said that they found it, right? So they really struggle with the idea that there should be limits on the way in which they engage with the public. But the question becomes, if you say that you're not racist, as this guy says, right, then not being racist means having a clear politic around how you don't get to use the N word. That has to be the baseline of what it means to not be a racist person, is that you are never caught out here or in private referring to Black people as the N word. Can we just start there as a baseline?
And also, whenever somebody says, well, if you look up the real meaning, according to the Webster's Dictionary of the word racist, I already know that's off the rails, right? So give us the Professor Crunk definition of racism so that people won't have to say, according to Webster's Dictionary, this is what racism means.
Look, racism means a couple of different things. It means the use of power to dehumanize and discriminate against people because of their race, particularly white supremacy being used to discriminate against anyone who is non-white. That discrimination can happen at the level of individual attitude. It primarily happens at the level of social policy. It can happen through the use of violence, but it can also happen through everyday acts of disrespect. But there's also a more pressing definition that we have to think about right now. The scholar Ruthie Gilmore says that racism can be defined as susceptibility to premature death, right? And so right before this segment, you talked about the way that we have been losing life expectancy, right? That is what it means to be a Black person in this country, is that that you don't get more time as the country gets better, you get less time. Time is stolen away from you. And so on every level, Black people are catching hell, are being discriminated against, are having to deal with all of this stuff. And then you go to a council meeting where you are there to help enact policy in a town that's 53% Black. And still, the way that white folks sort of assert their power is by saying, it doesn't matter that you outnumber us. It doesn't matter that the mayor is Black. I can still call you whatever I want, and I'm going to play from the Trump playbook and not be accountable and refuse to resign because they're basically doing a remix of Who Gon' Check Me, Boo, right? And that too, that even when you don't have political power, even when you're not in the numeric majority, that you can still choose to dehumanize people and still skirt accountability. That is the essence of white privilege, white supremacy, and racism. And this man checks all the boxes.
Brittney Cooper, a.k.a. Professor Crunk. You see why they call her that. Thank you again and always for your time. Up next, we'll show you who really might be picking up the tab for reparations. That's next on Prime.